All right, well, I am delighted to present alongside these other great researchers. I am going to shift gears a little bit, but fortunately for me, Sarah did a very nice setup at the beginning of the webinar about sort of the long-term big problems that we might think could help us get some traction on these challenges. So I'm going to be talking about work that is joint with Andrew Barr, who's at Texas A&M. And we're focused here on the very long term, in fact, the intergenerational effects of the Head Start program. So I want to tell you a little bit about Head Start. I know this is a very different sort of policy prescription or programmatic intervention than what we have been talking about. Head Start is, as many of you know, the federally funded program for typically preschool age children, so 3, 4, 5 years old, from disadvantaged families. And it began in 1965 as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's broader war on poverty effort. It was kind of the first out of the gate marquee program in that broader effort, and initially funded summer preschool programs for over 500,000 children. To show you a little bit about what this looks like over time, Head Start currently serves about 1 million children. The enrollment is denoted with this dashed line, to the tune of nearly $1 billion. And at its inception, the White House, which was where the sort of central organizing unit for the War on Poverty programs, the Office of Economic Opportunity, really emphasized medical, cultural, and self-esteem or self-discovery activities as being the purpose of this program serving young children. So you'll note there that there's actually no focus really on cognitive skill development or academic skill building, which is often how we think today about these sorts of early investments. I also want to highlight that Head Start participants were very disadvantaged. They continue to be, the program continues to focus on children from disadvantaged and low-income families today. But at the time of its inception, only 32% of mothers of Head Start children had a high school diploma or more schooling. About 70% of them were unemployed. Also, somewhat shockingly, 9 to 14% of families served by the program in those early years, depending on the year, didn't have running water at home. Infant and child mortality rates in the highest poverty counties in the United States looked like those of developing countries, and very few children in this context were participating in any kind of formal setting, daycare, nursery school, preschool, outside of the home before they entered formal schooling. So that is the context into which Head Start's being introduced. And I also want to emphasize Head Start's role as really a community center. It provided parenting programs, resources on child development, and also a healthcare provider. So for many children who participated in Head Start, this was their first time seeing a doctor and a dentist. And those visits, as chronicled in archival documents, uncovered numerous issues that then had to be addressed for children. So if you study any war on poverty programs, you have the benefit of a great LBJ quote, always, regardless of program. And so this is ours. So when reporting to Congress about the Head Start program, this is in May of 1965. So this is as Head Start is about to roll out across the United States in the summer of 1965. He says, "I believe this response reflects a realistic and a wholesome awakening in America. It shows that we're recognizing that poverty perpetuates itself. 5- and 6-year-old children are inheritors of poverty's curse and not its creators. Unless we act, these children will pass it on to the next generation like a family birthmark." And this is really sort of a motivating aspect of our work. So you see that Head Start hits various communities across the United States very quickly and somewhat sporadically over those early years. And so we're actually going to capitalize on the introduction of Head Start across counties and the differential timing of that to ask the question of whether Head Start's effects in fact transfer across generations. So does it in fact break the cycle of poverty as LBJ was describing it in that quote? So we're going to see mothers, or what we call the first generation, in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 1979 cohort, who were very fortuitously for us born from 1957 to the early 1960s. And so their timing of birth, when they're going to be 4 and 5 years old, is going to be right around the time that Head Start is rolling out, as you saw in the previous map of the United States, across communities. And so that is where we will observe Head Start exposure. And then we'll be able to look at their children and the children of the NLSY, what we call the second generation. And also importantly, we have information on the grandmothers in the NLSY 79 that's going to help us isolate or sort of drill down and look at mothers who we think were likely to be exposed to Head Start. And so just to put a finer point on it, if you think back to the map, the way to think about this is we're drawing largely two comparisons. One is that we will be comparing a 4-year-old in a county with Head Start to a 4-year-old in a neighboring county that has not yet gotten Head Start, right, based on the rollout across years. Similarly, we will be comparing a, say, 5 or 6-year-old child in a community before they've received Head Start, so that child is just too old to participate, to the child who is the right age, right, the just right age to have been exposed to Head Start. And here's what we find. So first, I'm going to show you, we have these 4 long-term outcomes for the second generation: high school completion, going to college, and then we've sort of reversed the sign on these outcomes. So not being a teen parent and no criminal engagement among a group that was not Head Start exposed. And so these are you can think of these as kind of the baseline rates. And now for those who were Head Start exposed, we see improvements across the board. And just to describe criminal engagement a bit more, this is survey data. So these are going to be self-reported any arrests, convictions, or probations, and also residence in a jail or prison at time of survey. So any of those would be counted as engagement with the criminal justice system. So this constitutes, Head Start exposure in the first generation constitutes a 12.5 percentage point reduction in criminal engagement for those whose moms were just right age to be Head Start exposed in the right place. I also want to show you this as compared to, so these are the high impact sample that I just showed you before. So these are individuals whose grandmothers did not complete high school. So we think they're very likely to have been exposed to Head Start if it was available in their county at the right time. These are the rates that we just saw in the previous slide for the Head Start exposed group. And I'm going to show you this compared to those whose grandmothers had high school education or more, what we think of as kind of an unlikely to have been exposed to Head Start sample. And what you see is that this intervention effectively closes the gap on these long-term outcomes. In fact, you see the Head Start exposed group in terms of not being engaged with the criminal justice system is doing better than a more advantaged group, a group whose grandmothers were more advantaged, right? So effectively closing that gap across generations. And so what are some of the mechanisms through which we might realize these long-term outcomes? So those outcomes that I showed you in the previous slides, we collapse those into 2 kind of summary metrics. One is that it's about a 1/4 of a standard deviation improvement in a summary index, a standardized index, if you're familiar with those that have been used in some of the long-term effects literature, but also corresponds to about a $35,000 summary wage improvement. So those outcomes, improvements across those outcomes, correspond to about a $35,000 improvement in your wages by age 35. So how is the Head Start rollout in the first generation improving that second generation set of outcomes? And we explore this a bit in our data. What we see is the main outcome that's improving for the first generation. Remember, these are all moms. So we actually can't really do the comparable criminal engagement metric for these women because those effects in the second generation and in other literature that has looked at the first generation effects of Head Start are concentrated among men. But we see educational attainment improvements for the moms. And then in the second generation, before those long-term outcomes are realized, we see that they themselves are more likely to participate in preschool and Head Start. They have better home and parenting environments as measured by these home scores. They're less likely to repeat a grade. They're less likely to have any sort of engagement with the criminal justice system as an adolescent. And they report higher levels of self-esteem. So these are likely some of the channels through which those broad improvements in long-term outcomes are being realized. So a few kind of key takeaways, I think, from this work. I think first that this is an existence proof that early childhood interventions can, in fact, have these lasting effects that transfer to the next generation, effectively breaking the cycle of poverty. And I think it's important to measure these preschool effects across generations. It should form how we think about the kinds of investments we make, both in young children and in their communities, and then how we measure the return on those investments. Our evidence suggests that, in fact, the second generation benefits alone pass a cost benefit test. And there's other evidence both from first generation effects of Head Start and from the Perry preschool program that the criminal justice effects, the reductions in engagement with the criminal justice system, can pay for the program in and of themselves. We think the second generation effects here are likely driven both through the direct effects of own preschool participation, right? We saw that this group, the second generation, is more likely to participate in preschool themselves, and through the many indirect effects of mothers' educational attainment improvements, right? And these are likely cumulative, multi-channeled, and affecting children both prenatally and in their early years and across childhood. I think it is important to note as a final point that we are always chasing these long run effects. Head Start is in fact the only context in which in the United States, we've had a long enough time horizon from the deployment of a large scale early childhood program to explore these intergenerational effects. But of course, given that framework and that setting, much has changed since then. And so it's somewhat challenging to think about the translation of these effects to current contexts and current programs and policies. But I think, again, we can demonstrate through this work that these kinds of programs can have these substantial spillovers to the second generation that are probably important when we think about the full effects and the full benefits realized by these programs. Thank you.